stretching across the southern borders of Utah, Colorado, and Kansas, multiple bizarre instances of mutilations have occurred. This strange phenomena seems to cluster around the 37th parallel, or the UFO highway. Hi, I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and this is Just Energy. Join us on an extraordinary and fascinating journey from El Paso and Rush, Colorado, to the mysterious Bigelow Air Force Base and MUFON, from Roswell to Area 51 and the Pentagon and beyond. To explore this strange phenomena, we'll be speaking to Ben Mezrich. Ben has created his own unique, addictive genre of nonfiction chronicling these amazing stories of young geniuses making tons of money on the edge of impossibility, ethics, and morals. With a writing career spanning 19 years, Ben has authored 16 books with a combined printing of over 4 million copies. His website is benmezrich.com, so please welcome Ben Mezrich. Ben, how's it going?
It's going good. Thank you for having me. How are you?
I'm doing great, and thanks so much for coming on the show today and talking about your book, 39th Parallel. I think it's going to be an interesting conversation, and one I think my listeners will really enjoy. But let's start here. It's your first time on the show. What got you interested in UFOs or extraterrestrial phenomena in the first place?
I never set out to write a book about UFOs. I come from kind of a skeptical background, I guess. My parents are scientists, and I grew up with that. I really was going to write a book about this guy's obsession. I thought I was writing a kind of Close Encounters story. Chuck Zukowski, who's the main character, I'd heard about him. He's a reserve sheriff's deputy in Colorado who was fired after investigating a cattle mutilation and got into the world of UFOs. So I really thought I was writing about this kind of crazy guy running around Colorado. But as I dug into it, I came to the conclusion that there's an awful lot of evidence or information pointing to, at the very least, certain cover-ups and maybe something more. And I got really into it, and I enjoyed the book, and I tried to dig into all of the stories that people in the UFO world already know, but I didn't know, coming from a different background. And it was really interesting to read all that stuff.
So do you consider yourself a skeptic still, or are you kind of like, as I like to say, are you moving over to the dark side?
I've moved very far into the dark side. I will say I am not at all skeptical that something happened at Roswell that has not yet been fully explained. I believe something crashed, and for whatever reason, the Air Force cannot identify the remains still. I think there's a very good chance that we were visited in that time period, in the late 40s, early 50s. I'm not going to say I believe every sighting. There's thousands and thousands of sightings, but I do think at least one of them is probably real. I think the reasons to not believe no longer make logical sense. I think people were, there were a couple reasons why people don't believe in UFOs, and I think those have fallen down.
Good answer. So let's kind of dig into this book and maybe give us a little background of who Chuck is.
Sure. Chuck Zukowski, he was a microchip engineer and also a reserve sheriff's deputy, was really into law enforcement, had always believed in UFOs himself, but had kept it separate from his job as a sheriff. Even so, he'd gotten the nickname the Mulder of El Paso, Colorado. Everybody kind of knew about his love, and so police officers would take him aside and off the record tell him all these UFO stories. But it all came to a head for him when he was investigating a cattle mutilation. Cattle mutilations are this phenomenon that I didn't know a lot about because it's never really covered in the mainstream. But 10,000 cows and horses have been found horribly mutilated, missing organs, missing eyes, completely drained of blood. This has been going on for 50 years. No one's ever been arrested. All the cuts are surgical. They look laser-like. So Chuck was looking into one of these, and he got interviewed by a television reporter. And after that interview, the police department fired him. So he dove into the world of UFOs. He has an RV, puts his family in the RV, and he just goes from UFO sighting to UFO sighting, trying to find proof. And for him, it all kind of came to a head first at Roswell, where he did an archaeological dig and found something, and then later when he started having run-ins with a very mysterious aerospace company. But it's a wild story, and I was really into it.
Sounds like it. Well, what did Chuck find at Roswell?
You know, Chuck did an archaeological dig with his sister. His sister is also a ufologist, is one of the directors at MUFON. They took part in a Sci-Fi Channel dig, but the dig itself was kind of a fake dig where they were digging so far down it was basically into the Jurassic period. Chuck managed to convince the archaeologist in charge to let him dig at the correct place, at the correct level, and he and his sister found a very small triangular piece of metal. It was very light. It had some weird properties to it. Chuck believed it matched what we think was found back in 1947 on the ranch. So he put out a press release. You know, he put out a press release at Roswell saying, "I have found something. I don't have the money to really analyze it. Will someone help me?" And he was contacted by Bigelow, Robert Bigelow's company, which has been investigating UFOs for 30 years. And that's a whole separate part of the book. And Bigelow's people took this little piece of metal and analyzed it, came to the conclusion that it didn't match anything in their database of known materials. But that isn't to say that it was extraterrestrial, but they didn't have anything to match it with. And I think that was pretty interesting. Then they cut off all contact, disappeared, and Chuck started to feel like they...
with his piece of metal, right?
Right, but it's a wild story, and you know, the whole Roswell incident is something I dug very deep into. You know, the details of it are fairly well known at this point. But for me, I had heard parts of it, but not the whole story before. And I think it's just one of those stories that it's not treated that well anymore because now it's all become kitschy, and you know, you dress up as an alien and go to a ball and eat hamburgers in a restaurant that's shaped like a flying saucer. But the real story involves the Air Force, involves a cover-up, and involves something that hasn't been explained.
Well, I think, you know, based on the stories you hear of the crash, that it only makes sense that miscellaneous little pieces would be left underneath some dirt that no one's really gone and shuffled around in that area to look for it. I mean, the military is going to get the big stuff, but if it's, you know, kind of hidden under something, they're not going to get little pieces that might be laying out there miscellaneously.
Right, and especially since, you know, it occurred in 1947, and the Air Force sent people over. They cleaned that ranch, that 300 yards of debris, as much as they could. But after that point, you know, they first put out a press release saying, "We found a flying saucer." Then they rescinded their own press release and said, "No, it's a weather balloon," and they faked that famous photo with the weather balloon. After that point, people pretty much, you know, didn't really analyze much about that field. There wasn't a lot of archaeological digs there. There weren't a lot of efforts to really find anything because people took the Air Force at their word after that point. It's only years later that people started to really look at it. By then there's erosion, there's storms, there's a lot of movement in the ground. So it wouldn't be in the place where the crash occurred, but a little bit off. And that's what Chuck managed to do, is try and analyze where that runoff would have led to. And that's maybe why he found something. But certainly, you know, if an airplane had crashed and the NTSB had gone out there, they would be finding pieces, you know, now. Because if you were really to bring the right equipment out there, I think you could find stuff.
Well, it would just be interesting if that little piece of metal would show, you know, registers on a metal detector.
It's a good question. I think it had elements of aluminum and silicon in it. It definitely, and in the book, I put a picture of, you know, the microscopic readings on it and all the information on it. So someone who knows about metal detectors would be able to tell you whether it would or not. Yeah, probably, you know, all the metal as described back in 1947 was very strange, was supposedly covered in hieroglyphics. When you lit, it tried to burn it, it didn't really burn, it just twisted upward. It was very light. It reminded people of Mylar, which was invented shortly after that. And so conspiracy theorists think, okay, maybe this led to the invention of Mylar or whatever it was. But it's an interesting material that's very light but metallic.
Well, and there are people that have said that, you know, what they found was actually Mylar, except there was the caveat that Mylar wasn't invented. at
Right,
that point in
exactly.
time. So it's like,
It was a magical weather balloon, a magical weather balloon. It's very intriguing when you look into it. I think the fact, that the government faked a photo, and everyone involved in that photo has come forward and said it was faked. It wasn't the debris from the field, and it was the photographer said, this was set up, and Marcel, who was in the picture, said this was set up. And that's an odd thing. If it had been a crashed weather balloon, why do you need to fake something? And why is that debris then carted off to Area 51, which is they didn't even admit existed, and not brought out into the public? Why not bring a piece and say, here, this is it, right here, take a look at it? Because it's not, and that's where it all gets very murky to me. There's different theories about what it could be, and it doesn't mean it's a alien. But when you add that to the Foo Fighter phenomenon, which occurred right before this, so in 1945, 1946, over the Rhine, American pilots and British pilots started to see these weird fireballs flying alongside their airplanes. And they would, be in formation. If you moved towards these fireballs, they'd disappear, then they'd reappear. This was such a phenomenon that it was covered by the New York Times in a huge article, which I put in the book, and then covered by newspapers all over the world. They thought, well, is this some strange German weapon? When we captured the German scientists after the war and interrogated them, they said they had no idea what this was. They had seen it as well. So it's something weird. And then right after that, you have the first flying saucer scene, and then you have Roswell. And so it makes me think that if something was going on, this is the time period to really focus on. There was this couple-year period, which also coincides with when we were inventing the atomic bomb, our first nuclear base. It's a big moment in human history, and it seems to be something was happening at the same time.
And so I wanted to kind of focus on cattle mutilation. So let's kind of go back there. So you said that I'm sitting here trying to do math in my head, which sometimes just doesn't work. And so so my math says cattle mutilations didn't start in the 40s.
Oh, they started in the 60s. And the most famous one was in the 60s. Chuck says he has data on cattle mutilations going way back, 1800s, 1700s. There are reports of animals in American Indian literature being mutilated. The whole skinwalker phenomenon goes back much farther, and then there's mutilated cattle involved with that. But in America, the most famous case was in the 60s. And in the 70s was this huge period of it, when the thousands and thousands of cattle were being found. It got so bad in the 70s that 3 state governors petitioned the Attorney General of the United States demanding an FBI investigation. The FBI conducted a 10-year investigation involving 100 agents who came to no conclusions, arrested nobody, no real evidence was found, no footprints, no fingerprints. These cattle drained of blood, no blood in the area, no footprints, no scuff marks, no signs of struggle. And the FBI came to zero conclusions. You can get the FBI file on it, there was a Freedom of Information Act, so you can get it, and it's full of pictures and comments and thoughts, but no answers. And that's staggering to me.
Because they couldn't make that leap.
Well, there wasn't, any evidence of human involvement. Nobody, there was one theory involving cults, but it would have to be a massive cult spanning many decades. Another theory involving this biker gang, because this biker came forward and said that he was part of a gang that was doing this, but that seemed really unlikely, and he was just trying to get out of jail with some story. And then their third idea was some science, somebody doing experimentation from the military or from a private company. But that doesn't seem likely either, because you can get your own cows. You don't have to go in the middle of the night and get some rancher's cow and then have no footprints and no evidence. No, the FBI did not make the leap to UFOs, although they did say one theory is UFOs, extraterrestrial, and then they never said anything again about that theory. But it's an interesting question, and even if you were to say it was UFOs, well, then you got to figure out what the heck's going on and why, which doesn't make a lot of sense either. So it's just a really weird phenomenon spanning many, many years. And Chuck has his own theories about it, and he certainly believes it's UFO related. And because, you do have a lot of sightings that coincide with it often. And you have things like, scorch marks or changes in the soil that seem to imply something else is going on. But there is no answer to it yet. But it's not even looked at. When you look through the literature, there's very little mainstream coverage of any of this stuff. and you're not having journalists look at it or scientists look at it. Chuck really was bringing these carcasses to vets, and these vets, you know, the specialists at the University of Colorado and in Colorado State, they'd never seen this stuff before, and this has been years, and they were blown away by these carcasses and the missing organs and the blood loss, and didn't have an answer for them as well.
You know, you made comment about scorch marks and other, I'm going to say, forensic evidence that occurred or appeared with these cattle mutilations. Did any UFO researcher go to these cattle mutilation sites to do any testing themselves, you know, from their perspective?
Yeah, so UFO research have certainly looked into this as well. The thing is that it's really always these lone people. There's no, you know, group with real scientific background, real equipment, looking into this the way, you know, one would look into a murder, or one would look into, you know, the forensic scientists you'd really need to do this properly, and they'd have to be very quickly onto the scene. You know, often when it happens on a ranch, and they call the local sheriff's department, the local police. Two cops show up, walk around a little bit, and say vandals, but they have no proof of anything, or they say, you know, it had to have been an animal, but they don't really know what it is, and so it's usually no real follow-up. There's no real investigation after that. It's just a dead cow with strange, you know, mutilation on it. Sometimes it makes the local news, sometimes it doesn't. After the fact, these ranchers often see black helicopters, things like that, which seems to imply that there's some sort of secondary investigation going on. Chuck believes that there are other people investigating this, whether it's Bigelow's company or whether it's some other government organization. He has often seen other signs of investigation going on. So someone else is interested in this. And that's part of what got so bad in the 70s. The reason the state governors demanded the FBI get involved was that they couldn't fly their helicopters over these ranches anymore to do land surveys because the ranchers would shoot at their helicopters. Because this has been happening so much. So, you know, there's something going on. Someone is looking into it, but we just don't have that information.
And I was always led to believe that the black copters flying at night were actually part of the phenomena, you know, and a potential explanation, versus what you said, that it was always kind of after the phenomenon.
It's after the fact. It's usually a day later, the next day. I don't think it's related necessarily. But I mean, in terms of it happening, doing it, I think it's an investigation after the fact.
Okay. I interviewed Edmund Gomez several years ago, and I can't remember if it was him that made this comment or who actually made this comment, but that they had observed that there were like paintball marks in like black light paint on the cows. Did you ever hear anything about that?
I didn't hear that from Chuck. I don't know. You know, I think that's interesting. I didn't get that from. I don't think that came up in Chuck's research. I'd have to ask Chuck about that and see what he said. I mean, he's really the expert on this stuff. No, I mean, I've seen, you know, weird scratch marks, grooves on the bones. The ribs have these weird grooves on them. You know, at Chuck's the thing that got him fired was at Rush, Colorado, and there was a dog that didn't die, that had a weird mark on it, was so traumatized that it will no longer leave the house. And there was another horse, a third horse, that didn't die, that also had weird marks on it, and was so you know, shaking and traumatized that eventually it had to be gotten rid of. But there wasn't any paintball marks that I know of there.
Well, they were saying they were black light.
Describing the same thing. Yeah, that's interesting. I know Chuck uses EMF readers, and he looks for radiation. I don't know if he looks under a black light or not. That's a good question.
Okay. I think it's interesting, you know, hearing about the trauma of these animals, because if it was a person putting a cow down, I don't think it would be traumatic to an animal. I mean, it might be weird to them, but not traumatic.
No, these other animals saw something. I mean, this dog, you know, won't leave the porch. It howls all night. And this was a dog that was a very friendly outdoor dog, and now does not go outside. And dogs are pretty smart, you know. It saw something that really, really bothered it. What that was, I have no idea.
Yeah. If they could only talk.
They don't.
Although I don't know that I'd want them telling my stories, so. um, so you mentioned about UFO sightings associated with it. Are they normally tied to when the event is happening? Are they before the event? Are they just kind of in the area? Other people are
Right.
seeing UFOs, and then, there's a mutilation event?
I think they're in the area. I think it's, these are usually UFO hotspots, places where people have seen things before. Often on the night of, there are weird lights or weird sounds that people talk about after the fact, so it gets a little bit murky in terms of, the timing of this stuff. There's never any witnesses to the mutilations themselves. There's no pictures when they happen, it only is after the fact. And even a few hours after the fact. Sometimes it's very close to when it seemed to have happened, but no one's seen it happen. But yes, and that's part of where the 37th parallel theory comes from, is that the majority of these cattle mutilations seem to occur on the 37th parallel, which also where many, and if not most, UFO sightings also occur along the same path. So there does seem to be some sort of correlation between these two phenomena. You would think you would see cattle mutilations just randomly dispersed all over the Midwest, but in reality, they run along this line.
And so, how big of an area? I mean, are we talking the whole 37th parallel, just a section of it?
Yeah, Chuck kind of moved along the area that he lived in, but then his sister was off in Missouri, and it actually spreads all the way across. And the majority of cattle mutilations are out in Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, places like that. You don't see them on the East Coast very often, or in California very often. So they all do seem to take place in kind of the central region. Yeah, I mean, but there are certainly UFO sightings all the way across the sort of 3,000 mile parallel, running all the way into DC.
How, location-wise, because there's always the talk about the base at Dulce, and I know that there were a number of mutilations that happened near in the I can never say that name, Arpa range.
Right.
So is that on the 37th parallel?
It is. Dulce is, the Mesa there is. Dulce is in the book, and the book kind of starts and ends there. There's some sort of underground base there, whether it's a U.S. military base or something else. It's clear that there is something there underground. Bigelow's people focused very heavily on that area. They bought Skinwalker Ranch. Skinwalker Ranch is this crazy ranch in Utah where there are stories about UFO sightings, cattle mutilations, these skinwalkers, which are these beasts that kind of appear and are soul-taking, and they're shape-shifting. All this kind of crazy stuff. Bigelow's people got interested. They bought the ranch, closed it to the public, and then installed a bunch of scientists in there with recording equipment, real equipment. They found some interesting stuff. Lots of photos of stuff. No smoking gun of any site. Then these same scientists were the ones who looked into Dulce, came to the conclusion that there was some sort of underground military base there, but never really got inside of it. Bigelow's stuff is really quite compelling. So Robert Bigelow is a guy who is a billionaire, made his money in real estate originally, Budget Suites of America, and on from there. Dedicated a large part of his fortune to trying to find the proof of UFOs, of alien life. Created something called the National Institute of Discovery Science, which was housed with real scientists in Nevada who would look into this stuff in the 80s, 90s. Then he started Bigelow Aerospace, which is a real aerospace company that makes pieces for the International Space Station, made deals with NASA, and then he has a deal with the FAA. If you look in the FAA manual that all of our civilian pilots use, in it, under what a pilot is supposed to do if they see something like a UFO, they don't report it to the FAA, they don't report it to the U.S. government, they report it to Bigelow. It's right in the manual, and I have that in the book. The U.S. government has outsourced this UFO investigation to a private aerospace company. That's quite spectacular to me. It's pretty wild. You would think that a pilot should report something to the FAA, but they are not supposed to because they can lose their job, and the FAA doesn't want to say this pilot is crazy, so they have outsourced it to a private company. So what Bigelow information, what he does with this information is it's not public, so we don't see it. We have no idea what he's found. He has thousands and thousands of files. that have gathered over years and years and years from our pilots, for instance, which seems like we should be allowed to see that, but that's just the way it goes.
Well, and I find that interesting if that's what his goal was to uncover this information, and then now he's just warehousing it. But, he has a contract with the FAA and he's making parts for NASA, so, maybe they've
Right.
gotten in bed and, it's all about the money, and that
Well,
made
and
it
that's
so
what,
that he is not
yeah,
talking.
people go back and forth on that. I think his goals and his aims are very positive. I think he's a friend to the UFO community, but at the same time, with these, the work he's doing for the International Space Station, he can't come out and say, "I'm looking for UFOs," and I think that makes it difficult for him. What he believes and what he's able to talk about are two very different things now. He used to be much more open about it. You would see him at symposiums. He would sponsor, he sponsored the STAR program, the STAR team program at MUFON for a while until he stopped doing that. Although people think he was doing that to get information before anybody else and then sending his own teams out. That's what Chuck believes. Chuck says whenever he'd investigate something, Bigelow people would be there already investigating it. So it's interesting. He's definitely running some sort of UFO investigation, very well funded with real scientists, but not releasing that information to the public.
And that's still happening now?
Absolutely. I mean, it's still in the FAA manual right now, this is current. It's pretty interesting. I had a major source within his company who was feeding me all of this stuff, tried to reach him many times. He's well aware of me, and we had, and it didn't end up happening. But he was going to do an interview with me, and then he wasn't. That's what usually happens when I write my books. It happened with Mark Zuckerberg too, with the Facebook story. He was ready to do an interview, and then he got scared and wouldn't do it anymore.
I could see, somebody like that, it just puts you into an awkward, you can kind of see it on one side, you can kind of see it on the other side. But it seems like, if this material was important to him and important for him to get out, that it could be leaked.
Right.
Well, I'm just going to leave these papers over here and they didn't come from me.
Right. You wonder. I mean, there's two different ways to look at it. One way is he hasn't found anything. He doesn't have any proof, and he's really looking for scientific proof. And the other way to look at it is he did find something, and he doesn't want it to come out. He is famously quoted as having believed, they did a study in the 60s about what would be the result if we announced tomorrow that flying saucers were real. And the study came to the conclusion it would be complete chaos, that society would crumble, that religions would fail, people would stop going to work. And in an interview, Bigelow parroted that. He said, if this information came out, people may not be able to handle it. And maybe he believes that. And I feel like we've changed. I think in the 60s that was probably true. In the 50s and 60s, we were not at a place where we could see something like that. But now, with what we see every day, this world is crazy. I don't think it would be that big a deal to people. I think an alien could walk through a mall right now and most people would say, hey, there's an alien. I don't think people would freak out. Certainly the youngest generation right now would have no issue with it at all. So I think we've changed our opinions in the last 50 years, and it's time.
Come on, everyone's seen the X-Files.
Everyone's seen all these movies and TV shows, and it's look at the political landscape. We've got enough weirdness going on that I don't think a flying saucer would be the weirdest thing in the news that day.
Agreed. Yeah, I don't understand why disclosure is just so hard for the government to fess up to it,
Right.
or to put that information out, because I do think that people have changed, and I feel like people are just really ready to be told the truth, and what my position is if they tell the truth about UFOs, then what about all of this other material that they haven't been sharing with us? Would they really need to disclose, like JFK and this and that? And are they just keeping it close to their vest because it would make them be vulnerable to questions in other areas?
Yeah, it's interesting. And let's just, I want to put it out there that not all conspiracies are bad. Not all hiding of information is bad. There are certain things that need to be kept secret. I'm not of the belief that everything should be out in the open. You look at the Manhattan Project, which I get into in the book in a big way, the project to develop the atomic bomb. involved 100,000 people, of which only 15 knew what they were doing. It was the biggest secret we ever kept. We had created secret cities where this took place. The Office of Censorship was created. It went through the newspapers, magazines, even comic books, cutting out the words atomic or nuclear. So even Buck Rogers comic books were edited so that you wouldn't see the word atomic. And this was a huge, huge conspiracy. But they did it for the right reason. You know, they felt like they were developing a weapon to end a war, and they didn't want this information getting out. And so not all secrets are necessarily bad, and there might be a reason to keep something a secret until there's a moment when it has to come out. So I'm not always against the idea of secrets, but in terms of Roswell, in terms of sort of a craft crashing, I can't imagine why now it can't be released.
All right, we're here talking with Ben Mesrick about his book, The 37th Parallel. Ben, you were talking about the government covering stuff up for good reasons, for, you know, there are secrets that we have, military secrets. How deep do you think the rabbit hole goes? You know, we're talking about UFOs, but it just seems like everything's a secret, you know, from Hillary's health to what's going on at Dulce. And, you know, this past year there has been, you know, the false flag events. There's this part of me that just goes, well, is there anything that we are really being told the truth?
Well, I do think there is this culture, especially in the Air Force in the past, and still now in our security agencies, to lie first and then decide whether the lie was a good lie or a bad lie. I think, you know, Hillary is a perfect example. You know, she gets sick. Her first instinct is, I'm not going to talk about it. I'll just cover it up. Then she realizes, oh, okay, maybe I can just tell people. And the problem is that you get caught into this system where you're lying before you really realize whether you should lie or not. I think this happens a lot. I do think, for instance, you know, in terms of the UFO thing, if the Air Force investigates something, they immediately keep it as secret as they can at first. Then they make a decision whether or not they can release anything or not. And sometimes those decisions just piggyback on each other and go for years and years and years. I think the Roswell situation may be that something crashed, they grabbed it, they had no idea what it was. They rescinded the press release saying it was a flying saucer, shipped it off to Area 51, and then never put another release out about it. Still, we're trying to figure out what it was. Maybe eventually they did figure out what it was, but at that point, all of these lies had kind of compounded themselves, and they weren't going to release that information. You know, recently Hillary was on Jimmy Kimmel, and she said, one of the first things I want to do in office is get these files, these UFO files, released. When asked if she believed whether we'd been visited or not, she said, I wouldn't be surprised. This is someone who had access to everything you can have access to. Bill Clinton, her husband, famously tried to get these files out there as well and was unable to. And that's an interesting thing. You know, the Air Force has files the president can't release. And this secrecy, who needs to know? Who's allowed to release it? It gets very murky when you look into these things. And I think these things get set in place a long time ago, but can't be kind of unveiled. And it becomes a whole process to get through this stuff. And you slowly see information come out. I do think we're at a point where things are about to happen in this world. We're getting closer and closer to releasing things. It feels like there's been a change where people now accept that there's life out there. This is something that 50 years ago people would not have accepted. Now we find Earth-like planets every day. People used to think it was way too far away, but now we know that's not true. You know, Proxima Centauri isn't that far, and we could get there with today's technology in 40 years. So the idea that these things couldn't happen no longer holds. And I think as people become, you know, more okay with that, more understanding that science has changed our views of what's possible and what's not, that the UFO thing will come out of the fringes and more into the mainstream.
But, you know, the government pretty much has gotten out of the UFO business, you know, after Project Blue Book.
Private now. So that's the thing, is this is what the government's doing in everything, is that the government shifts these responsibilities over to private companies who continue the exact same work, and they have government contacts, they have government ties, maybe government oversight, but they're now in private hands. That's exactly what Bigelow is doing. So Project Blue Book ended, certainly, but the government interest in this stuff did not go away.
For a phenomena that doesn't exist. I mean, that's the part that's like, well, wait a minute. If there isn't anything, then why do you keep looking into it?
Right, and that's, listen, there are so many witnesses. What's crazy is, if you were to have 100 witnesses say that someone killed someone, that would certainly be enough to convict them in a court of law. But if you have 100 witnesses saying they saw a UFO, it's meaningless. And so that's kind of this interesting situation where first-person witnesses are important in everything except for ufology.
And ghosts.
Right, and ghosts as well. And the ghost phenomenon is a whole another one that I don't know a lot about. But certainly, we're so quick to discount personal encounters. We're quick to throw that out without really looking into it. And I'm hoping with my book, people will at least look at it. It's more of a travelogue into the world of UFOs for the mainstream audience. People who have lived with this and know this world much better than me might find some of the book, okay, I know this story, I know this story. But I think it's interesting to see it through Chuck's eyes, who's someone who's really trying to dig into it and get into it, and I hope it opens it to a whole new audience.
And I find it interesting, you were talking about people that have witnessed UFOs, that some of the people that have had sightings are ex-military officers, air pilots, people that would recognize one kind of plane from another kind of plane, and that's not a plane.
Right, and also these are people who are risking their careers, in some cases losing their careers over an incident, and it's hard to discount them. There are definitely people out there who see something and you're like, okay, that guy's probably crazy. But when multiple military officers at a base have seen something some night and get forward and put out affidavits and risk their entire reputation and their family's reputation to talk about something, they certainly saw something. What it was, we don't know because we don't investigate it, or if we do, we keep those files secret. What I hope is that when something is seen, that people really look into it, that there's an organization that goes and really looks into it in a public way. That's what Chuck tries to do, is make it as public as possible. But he's one guy with an RV. He's a guy with no money. His wife works 2 jobs to support this habit of his. She doesn't believe. She's a skeptic. She thinks he's crazy. So he's doing this alone on his own, and that's not really how we should be looking into something that could be very significant. There should be an NTSB for UFOs. There should be an organization that really goes and scours the ground until we have an exact answer. Each one of these incidents should have a very good answer. Even if it's a military missile that went off course, or a weird, trick of the light, whatever it is, that answer should come forward after each UFO sighting. There's no reason why it's just left to the evening news. There was a UFO, 300 people saw it, and then move on to the next story. Let's just get an answer each time, and that's it's not so hard. We have the facilities to look at these things, and we have the ability to do it. People just don't do it.
But when they're in the sky, it's a fairly transient event. So unless it's picked up by radar, there is no physical evidence.
Well, that's the thing, is that if this were a crime we were talking about, we would painstakingly reconstruct it. We would interview all of the witnesses and match their stories up, find out whether they're, honest, credible, not credible. There would be a lot to it. A lot of crimes occur in the middle of the night and are transient as well, and yet we slowly piece it back together. And I think that, if there was evidence, if you're not looking for it, you'll certainly never find it.
Well said. So let's go back to Chuck for a second. With all of his investigating and going to all these different locations and being vocal about what he's finding, has he had any run-ins with, like the Men in Black or anything like that?
Yeah, he has, and this is all from Chuck's point of view, so you have to decide whether you find him credible or not. But he believes he's been followed. He multiple times has arrived at a UFO investigation to have other investigators already there, which he believes are from Bigelow. He had an incident at Area 51 where he went up Tikaboo Creek and tried to look in, and really saw some stuff, he believes, and then there were these 2 kind of crew-cutted military-looking guys who tagged along with him and seemed to be asking a lot of questions, and he confronted one of them, and the guy basically told him, listen, you're just a UFO nut, you're no threat, and told him to go away. So Chuck really did have these run-ins, and he believes they're very aware of what he's doing. And yes, so I think, a lot of the people you talk to who investigate this stuff or spend their time doing this feel like they're being watched and feel like someone is interested in what they're doing. And, you know, often after the fact, there are these helicopters that seem to appear over cattle mutilations. There does seem to be at least some sort of organization that's looking into the same things. And the Bigelow stuff is very real. You know, they specifically do this. So, yes, but, you know, I don't think Chuck's been threatened. I think he's felt that way a little bit, but I'm not sure there's been any overt kind of thing like that.
But see, that's good. I mean, there are so many people that work in the UFO field, alternative history type field that, you know, feel that they are threatened. You know, well, I mean, I've watched these YouTube videos where, you know, someone will say, okay, so I'm making this video and it's pretty controversial. And so if I die in a week or so, it's probably because of this. I'm in good health. I mean, I've seen these prefaces and I'm like, okay, that's kind of scary that people have this kind of underlying belief.
People, listen, I do think that there are organizations that look into this stuff and are interested in it. I think the danger is more a facet of if you're deep into this world, you might get very paranoid. As a journalist, my last book was about Russian oligarchs. And these are people who literally do murder each other. And journalists have been murdered. And, you know, I went into that story, and that was a very big story in which, you know, there are specific dangers to it. But the reality is people don't actually kill people that often. Journalists in America don't get murdered for writing stories for the most part. I don't believe that investigating UFOs will actually put you into danger because for the most part, the government or whoever it is knows that you're going to get mocked anyways. They don't need to do anything to you because, honestly, it's not taken seriously. That's their biggest weapon in terms of covering it up. If they were out killing people, that would raise a lot of attention. But letting someone go on YouTube and talk about whatever they want to is the best cover-up of all because no one takes it seriously. So I don't think those fears are really that justified. I think, you know, if someone really overturned the wrong rock and felt like, okay, now I've shown the world something really significant, that would be different. But, you know, those rocks don't get overturned that often. I think that's it. Listen, if you tried to climb the fence and wander into Area 51, you're probably going to end up somewhere. And that's absolutely true. But writing about Area 51 or writing about, you know, Roswell, I really don't, you know, listen, hey, who knows, right? But I really think for the most part, it would be crazy for any organization to go after people for stuff like that when it's completely unnecessary. Let people say what they want. No one's going to take them seriously anyways. And, you know, back in the 50s, the Air Force would send officers to these UFO symposiums because they thought this is the way we cover ourselves up. We could do a military test of some secret weapon. Everybody's going to think it's a UFO. I'll send an officer over and say, yeah, UFOs, UFOs. And everyone kind of jokes about it. They play funny music, and it goes away. And it's the ultimate cover-up. It's right in plain sight, you know. And I think that these people are very smart. People in security agencies are incredibly good at their jobs. And they're not running around killing people unless it's, you know, on a whole nother level. Like a Snowden, for instance. Certainly if he had stuck around the United States, something would have happened to him. And he knew that, and something probably still will happen to him. You know, he's pretty much marked. But that's a different level of uncovering something. Look, if you had an alien baby in your basement, that's a whole different story. But if you're just talking about a theory, you know, I don't think there's any dangers.
All right, so I had a question that just totally left my mind. Oh, I know what it was. Do you think, you know, you mentioned about, you know, they're going to do some military operation and then they're going to run around and say, oh, it was a UFO thing. Do you think that that's been employed? And if it has been employed, what percentage of the time has that been used as a smokescreen to cover up some military operation?
I mean, it definitely is well documented in the 50s and 60s. They absolutely were doing this. They would use UFO sightings and UFO. You know, they would often fire a missile in the wrong direction, and a news report would come out that a UFO was sighted, and they would send agents to you know, UFO symposiums and talk about a sighting that happened, knowing full well that it was one of their craft. One of the Bigelow investigations in the 80s was really interesting. The main UFO people were seeing in the 80s was something called a big black delta. which was a giant black triangle like the size of a football field that would rise up and then speed off at incredible speeds. Well, Bigelow's scientists looked into this and they correlated it with a military base, and they got someone inside and they discovered that the military base was working on these giant triangular inflatable blimps that moved at incredible speeds using kinetic energy. So that was what most people were seeing. And so that explained away one of these sort of big UFO types. I think there are numerous things like that, when they were developing the stealth bomber around Area 51, there were a lot of sightings in the area. And the government doesn't, discount these things. It doesn't come forward and say, oh, no, that's a military thing. They allow it to grow because it hides what they're really doing. And that's where you get into the Roswell thing again. Was it some experimental, one theory I heard that actually seemed pretty good was that they were doing something fairly unethical. Maybe they were testing high altitude on a pilot. So they shot a pilot really high up into the air, and then it came down and crashed. They certainly wouldn't want to put that out there. So they used the UFO thing to hide something that they did unethical. And that seems like a possible answer to what's going on. It doesn't explain the hieroglyphics. It doesn't explain some of the other things about it. But I think some of these things are certainly that, and they're very happy to keep the UFO talk going if it hides what they're really doing.
Our government at work, it just makes me smile.
I mean, it's not sort of a nefarious individual, this malicious kind of bad guy in the government, this Rumsfeld figure, or whatever you want to say, who's doing it for evil reasons. It's, military procedure when you're working on a project that ought to be secret. The stealth bomber needed to be secret. So how do you cover this up? If a piece crashes somewhere, you certainly don't want everyone knowing what it was, and so you use whatever you have at your disposal. When you have a file, you don't let everyone have access to it. These are all not bad things, but in the end, it gets so obscured that it becomes very hard to sort of pick out what's real and what's not.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So in Chuck's research, what kind of crafts did he do reporting on, because you were talking about this triangular blimp kind of craft, which brought to mind like the Phoenix Lights, which was a big rectangle, triangle. Did he, in his research, investigate a number of different kind of crafts other than just, your standard flying saucer kind?
All the famous crafts of the cigar-shaped one, which is seen a lot, which is this giant cigar with lights around it, the saucer shape, the triangle shape, and then you have the probes, the pulsing one, which is sort of a pulsing light in the sky, the fireballs, which are seen often. Chuck really gets into the fireballs a couple times in the book, which sort of remind you of Foo Fighters. Those are seen a fair amount, and they're very odd. They're often mistaken with fireworks. And there's one great scene in the book where essentially, he thinks he's seeing flying saucers when really he's seeing illegal fireworks fired off over the mountain. And I think what's interesting about that is, like I say, 99% of these things are going to be explained away. And that's really what people like Chuck are trying to do, is explain each of their sightings away until they get to the one they can't explain. And I think that that's part of what this is all about. There's those main types of crafts. And then there's the different types of aliens that people claim to have seen. Chuck, employs an interesting police tactic where he pretty much asks anyone who's seen a type of alien how they walk, because the ones that he thinks are most credible walk a certain way, the description of how an alien would walk. Which is
okay, tell.
So, according to Chuck, the gray aliens, which is kind of the most archetype of what aliens are, the short ones with the big heads that are all gray, with the big features, they walk in kind of this shuffle fashion where they kind of slide their feet along. And so if he asks someone how they walk and the people don't describe it that way, he discounts them for the most part. He thinks they're probably not seeing what he believes is a gray. So it's one of the things he does, take it for what it's worth, whether direction you want to go. But it's interesting. So he does get into a lot of the different UFO types, but really he just goes from thing to thing, and whatever is seen there, he tries to get as deep into it as he can. Chuck's issue, if he has an issue, and I think a lot of people in this world do have this issue, is they're too easy to believe. You know, there's two sides to this story. There's people who just don't believe, and there's nothing you can do to change their mind. And you could fly a flying saucer into their house, and they would think it was a special effect. But there are also people who are just too willing to believe. They believe everything. Every sighting has to be real, and every type of UFO has to exist, and the government is doing this, and there's reptilians, and there's craziness, and that's you have to sift through that as well. As a writer, it's very hard to take that credible because certainly not everything can be real. There has to be this middle ground. There has to be some of one of these things might be true, and that's where I try and go. Chuck is a believer now. He wasn't originally, and he does approach it from a scientific way. But he certainly believes most things now, and he's certainly open to it, which is admirable and which is great. But that's why you have to sort of dig into whatever he's talking about.
Well, and I think as you like yourself, you start digging into some of this phenomena and the reports and the sightings and the evidence, that after a while, when it comes from enough different sources, from enough different places, you have to take a step back and go, well, maybe this isn't just a bunch of hooey, and that there really is something going on. I might not know exactly what it is, but there is something going on, and we can't just blame the government for all of it.
Right. No, and absolutely. I think I do come back to that I think in the 40s and 50s something did crash. And you know what? Until I see evidence of what that is, because I know it's there, it leaves the door open to that. And I think that, as I said, the reasons for not believing are going away. There's no reason why an extraterrestrial visit is impossible. There's nothing about it anymore that is scientifically implausible even. So I think it's got to be one of the choices,
Exactly. I asked you that question. Okay. I just have one other back to cattle mutilation, sorry. Sure. With that phenomena, you talked about the 60s and the 70s. How recent have there been mutilations? Because there was that big spurt that happened in the 70s, and then you kind of didn't hear about it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, it continued. It continued into the 80s and the 90s, and Chuck is still doing it, and he's had 2 last week, which you just sent me photos from. I mean, they happen all the time. They're just not part of the news cycle anymore. It occurs, a cow is found, mutilated badly. There might be a story in the local paper in Colorado, wherever it occurred, and then it disappears. The vast majority of them in the 70s and 80s, they became really big news because there were so many going on, and it was hundreds and hundreds. It was literally every week. But now it still does go on. At least once a month it occurs, and yeah, it's not. But it's still going on, absolutely.
But I just find that so fascinating. I mean, I recognize that on a cattle ranch, the area that they have is just so vast and the idea of hooking up security cameras on their property is...
People have done that, and the cameras never get anything. For whatever reason, the cameras go dead, the battery doesn't work, and a lot of people think that it's related. But a lot of times equipment doesn't function around these phenomenon, and that's why you don't see a lot of it. But yeah, it's a good question. I mean, you would think, and certainly Bigelow's people have tried to do this at Skinwalker. They had cameras everywhere, and still, a cow would be mutilated and they'd have nothing on the camera.
Interesting stuff. Well, our time is kind of running out, so if somebody wants to get a copy of your book, The 37th Parallel, where's the best place to send them?
37th Parallel, it's on Amazon, it's everywhere. It should be at every airport in your local bookstore. I'm at Ben Mesrick on Twitter and benmesrick.com and Ben Mesrick on Facebook, so you can find me. But certainly it's at every bookstore, so hopefully people will grab it and pick it up.
Okay, so this is the question I ask everybody. So if they want an autograph copy, yes, is that possible?
It is, absolutely. Go on Twitter at Ben Mesrick, and I'll get a DM going with you, and I'll be able to send you book plates if you send me your address. So yeah, find me on Twitter, and we can set that up.
Yeah, because that's the priceless part.
Excellent. Well,
and anything exciting up next for you?
Yeah, I'm working. Well, we're going to do the movie of this. New Line picked up the movie, and it's the producer who did San Andreas, the big earthquake movie.
Hmm.
So we're getting ready to shoot that movie next year. It's going to be really cool. So that will be a big project.
Well, that'll be interesting, because there aren't really any UFO movies from an investigator perspective, per
Not a
se.
nonfiction movie. Yeah, it's going
Yeah.
to be really interesting. So I think it should be very, very cool.
And so
Yeah,
everybody needs to like keep their eye out for it. That'll be fun.
absolutely.
All
Thank you.
right. Then I'm going to let you go. And
Well,
thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about cattle mutilations and the government and all kinds of great stuff.
all right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you. So you have a great day.
Too. Bye bye.
All right. Bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed. Well, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Ben Mesrick, his book, The 37th Parallel, his website. Well, I hope you enjoyed this interview with Ben Mesrick about his book, The 37th Parallel.